Groisman, and I'm excited today to have with me virtually Congressman Henry Cuellar. Congressman Cuellar represents Texas's 28th congressional district, serving his 10th term in Congress. He's a ranking member of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Homeland Security, amongst others. That's the most relevant for our discussion today. He's from the great city of Laredo, Texas, which I've been to many times. I have family there. It's right on the border. A lot of commerce, a lot of interesting history. He's the dad of 2 girls. I'm the dad of 5 girls, so I'm winning by 3. But we could talk about that later. Thanks so much, Congressman, for being on.
Thank you, Gabe. And again, it's a pleasure, and my best to your family. And come down to Laredo again whenever you can.
Absolutely. Congressman, you've always been a strong voice on the border. Your famous statement that I've seen over and over online that you say on the floor is, you visit the border, I live there. You established Democrats for Border Security. And, I'm excited to talk to you a little bit just to get your insights and perspective on an otherwise complex issue. People like to oversimplify the border and oversimplify immigration. It's not. From where I sit, the issues, the complexity, the issues that go towards the complexity are the border fence, including the patrol agents and technology, actual security, policies like Remain in Mexico, benefits for migrants from cities that some argue are a lure for migrants to come into our country, lax and broken asylum standards, and then, of course, an overwhelmed immigration system, including the courts. So we'll start with, what else have I missed as far as complexities of this issue that people should be looking at when looking at this from a wholesome perspective?
Gabe, I think you hit it right in the nail, and I appreciate that, because you're the first one that's talked about the multi-dimensions dynamics that we see at the border. Anytime people talk about the border, they think about immigration. They talk about, the what's happening there. They think that crime is high here at the border, but it's not. It's a different thing. First of all, trade and tourism is so important. Last year, we had more than $863 billion of trade between the U.S. and Mexico. Jobs are created on both sides of the border. Trade is important. Tourism is very important. And this is why the border should be looked at as not only a trade or tourism area, but also one of the safest places along, really the whole United States. When you look at the crime statistics from the FBI, you will show murder, rape, assault at the border. Every city is lower than the national crime rate. And I always use this as an example. Washington, D.C., where I work, is about 3, 4, 5 times more dangerous, especially when it comes to carjackings in Washington, than the border. So the border is safe. Trade is tourism. People love the border, but unfortunately, some people just paint it as a war zone. And you've been to the border. It's not a war zone. It's a beautiful place to live. So thank you for putting that perspective to start off with.
Yeah, well, the crisis, of course, at the border, it's safe at the border because one of the main reasons is because it's flooded with federal agents and state agencies. There's law enforcement everywhere, and that's something you don't see, unfortunately, in major cities across our country. We have mayors that are afraid to use law enforcement prophylactically. It's always a response to an incident as opposed to putting police officers on every corner so law-abiding citizens feel safe. And you see a lot of that at the border. And of course, the issue with the border isn't really the border in and of itself. It's what that does for the rest of the country when we have levels that we've had in the last 3-4 years that we've never had before in our history. But let's talk about Texas in particular. How have Texas cities been impacted by the vast increase of migrants into the country in the last couple of years?
Well, keep in mind that some of this issue started happening like in 2013. Before that, but in the old days, it was people coming from Mexico that were looking for a job. Then that was in the, before the 90s. And in the early 2000s, you started having people from Central America. Then somebody figured out that there's something in the law that if you bring a child, you can be allowed in a lot faster, a lot quicker. Somebody figured that out. And, it was the bad organizations that figured that out. And then in the 2000s, 2010, around that area, you start getting family units and unaccompanied kids coming in. And then at the end of the 2019, around there, you start seeing people from all over the world coming in and say, hey, all we have to do is come to the southern border. So I've seen a change from single male adults from Mexico now to people from over 50, 60 countries that are coming to the border. Now, what we see here is every place is different. For example, in Laredo, Laredo's been the lowest crossing area in the whole country for years. We haven't seen family units. We don't see unaccompanied kids. Laredo and West Texas are the lowest crossing areas. But what happens, the organizations, and they make, let's say, an average $8,000. So if we've had, 7-8 million people, multiply that by an average of 8,000, you can see that the bad guys make billions of dollars getting people to the border and across. They make billions of dollars on drugs. So what we're seeing is very complex organizations that once Border Patrol puts resources, and you remember in the old days, it was a Rio Grande Valley. And then once they put resources, they send them to Eagle Pass and Del Rio. Then they send them up to El Paso. Then the number one crossing right now is in Tucson. So the organizations will shift people around depending where our Border Patrol agents are at. So we're dealing with a very agile, very bad organizations that make so money crossing people, smuggling, trafficking people, and drugs also, and extortion.
Right, I understand. And how has that impacted the actual lives of residents in these cities in Texas? Like, for example, in El Paso, we know they've been overwhelmed. Before they built a shelter, they had about 400 beds, as far as I understand it, which were meant to be for homeless people, and they were getting up to 2,000 people a day coming to El Paso on the worst end of it, but on average, 400 to 500 every single day. So they were overwhelmed. I know the city of Laredo, where you live in, declared a state of emergency, likely to just try to unleash some funds to try to help them deal with the processing that happens in Laredo. Because as I understand it, migrants are brought to Laredo for processing. It's not where they mostly cross for these, but it's having obviously a big impact economically on the cities around Texas. I was trying to see if you can shed some light on that, on the day-to-day lives of people in Texas.
Yes, and depending on the city, like in El Paso and Del Rio, they got overwhelmed, and therefore the monies of a program that I started back in 2014 and added the first $30 million in 2017. $30 million, I set up this food and shelter program to help the non-for-profits and border communities. Then we moved it to $100 million during the COVID because of the vaccines and the mask and all that. And then when New York, Chicago, Colorado, and the other places started getting this people, then all of a sudden it jumped up to $800 million because they were saying we need help with food and shelter. So every community is impacted. Laredo hasn't really, yes, the mayor declared an emergency. We didn't have an emergency, without due respect, but he wanted to get some of those federal funding from the program that I mentioned. But, in certain places like Eagle Pass and certainly El Paso, they got overwhelmed. And we've seen that in the Valley also. And that's why that food and shelter program that I started back in 2014 has been key to help the local taxpayers.
That's great. And Congressman, what's your perspective on this back and forth between the state of Texas and the federal government, where the state of Texas seems to be trying to put in all these measures in place to enforce the border, to protect the border, to put, whether it's floating barriers in the river or building the wall themselves, which we've seen them efforts for eminent domain that were recently deployed by the state to build the wall themselves. And the federal government is mostly opposing what the state is doing. From the outside, if we take a step back for a minute, which is hard for all of us that care about this to do, and I'm sure for you it's even harder since you live there and you live and breathe this every day, what do you make of that tension between the state and the federal government in their different approaches to dealing with the border?
If I had it my way, I would put the state and the federal government in one room and say, work together with the local government so we can provide security and address the issue in a more comprehensive way. And unfortunately, it's not. Depending who the president is, they take a different position. I understand the state of Texas is frustrated. I've been very frustrated. I join in their frustration. But I think the law has been very clear. The Supreme Court has been very clear. And I think they're testing this through that latest bill from Texas, Senate Bill 4. Who has the power to enforce immigration law? It's the Border Patrol. It's not any state agency. It's the Border Patrol. And I think 150 years have shown that the Supreme Court, through precedent, said it's the federal government that enforces that law. Otherwise, you would have 50 states that would be 50 many countries enforcing their own immigration. So I would ask them to work with the federal government. I asked the federal government to work with the state of Texas, and the state is trying to do whatever they can. Some of it is more symbolic. For example, when they put the buoys, those buoys were less than a quarter of a mile long, less than a quarter of a mile.
Oh, it looks like we lost the congressman. Let's see if he comes back on a second. Oh, there you are.
Stench in the middle of a football field and stop that running back from coming across with a postage stamp less than a quarter of a mile for 1,200 miles. So again, I wish that the state could work with the federal government, and I asked both of them to work together.
Yeah, the underlying legal issues are very, very interesting because every state, as I understand it, does have the right to enforce its own borders with other states. But when the other state is another country, that's really the question. I think that's going to go before the Supreme Court. And if the court determines that the Supreme Court, that the federal government is not meeting its obligations, whether the state can do that as long as it complies with federal law. That's my understanding of the framing. And as a fan of what happens at the Supreme Court and federal law, I'm excited to see where it goes, and I hope it lands in the right place. I know you're very short on time, so I just want to go to the next question, which is to not dive into the whole the federal bills that have been going back and forth and haven't gone anywhere, because that'll be an hour conversation, which by the way, I look forward to having with you in person whenever you want and whenever your schedule allows. I think we can all agree that the legislature hasn't been able to address this issue for years and for decades, if not just for years. And so now the question is this, that the problem is obviously something that needs to be addressed, and the sooner the better. It really needs to be addressed now. The problem at the border, the number of crossings is over almost 3 million this year on actual touches, on actual encounters, and we don't even know those that weren't encountered. What would you, as someone who really lives and breathes this again, what would you urge the government to do today? And when I say the government, I mean that broadly, whether it's the executive branch or the legislature, as a way to stop the bleeding today.
There's two things. One is appropriations and for border security, and the other one is for changes of the law. For example, I think the asylum law is too easy, where people can come in, because if you let 100 people in at the border, and then at the end of 4, 5, 6 years, it takes that long to go before an immigration judge, a judge is going to reject 87 to 90%. So why are we allowing 100% when we should be allowing maybe 12 to 10% of the people? Because that's what a judge is going to decide at the end of 4, 5, 6 years. So one is the change of the law, which I support changing the law. The Senate bill had good changes. It was bipartisan. But you saw what happened because of the politics. The other ones are appropriations. Let me take the 3 years of appropriations for Homeland. The last 2 years, not this one that we just did a week ago, but the last 2 years, we added monies for Border Patrol, for technology, for things at the border. Every single Republican, except for two that are still there, when we added $1.4 billion the last 2 years, but
looks like we lost the congressman again. Let's see.
Because
there we go.
They didn't like the president. They voted, every single Republican except for two voted against this. Now, this time we had, a little bit over 100 Republicans out of the majority that supported it. But I can tell you, David Joyce, the Republican chair of Homeland, and myself, we sat down together and we put in the largest amount of Border Patrols, agents, 22,000, overtime, pay increases, technology. We added that. We sat down as Democrats and Republicans, David Joyce and I. We can do that. If there's a will, we can do it the way David Joyce and myself did.
Yeah, I can't get into the bill now because it would blow the time that you have allotted to me. But there's a lot to talk about that and to unpack. What about by way of executive order? I think Trump passed about 437 executive orders on immigration. Not all of them were implemented. It was over 400 or so that were implemented. Are there any executive orders that you would urge the president to pass that you think can be helpful now, at least in these next few months?
Yes, and let me just answer this as the last question, and I apologize.
No problem.
Yes, I mean, certainly the President Biden can do that. What President Trump did in a very smart way, he followed what the law is. Here's an executive order on Title 42. That was the law. All he did was repeat what Title 42 was. And then finally, the President Biden can do the same thing on Title 8 like President Obama did and force Title 8 expedited removal. So yes, I think the president can do a lot of things on executive order, especially now that we added billions of new monies for Homeland Security. And with that, I just want to say thank you, Gabe. I look forward to seeing you in person, and please send my best to your family.
Thank you so much, Congressman Cuellar. Thanks so much for your nuance and diving deep, even just for a few minutes. Thank you to the audience for listening of the special edition of Standpoint, and we'll see you on Tuesday for a new episode.
Thank you, Gabe.
Thanks, Congressman.